In our study of Hebrews so far, we've talked about the amazing privilege of having Jesus as our high priest. Unlike the Old Testament priests who had to make blood sacrifices for their own sin and eventually died, Jesus himself is our perfect, eternal priest who gave himself as our once-for-all sacrifice for sin. And now he's at the right hand of the Father, always making intercession for us. We talked about the worship service where we do the work of the people, the liturgy, and are ushered into the most holy place, the very presence of the living God, through the veil of Jesus' flesh and through his sprinkled blood. And it's there that we sing with the angels and archangels, holy, holy, holy. Jesus himself leads us in this service as he's the celebrant, the great liturgist, as we hear the very voice of God and are invited to respond. We also talked about the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us, the saints who have gone before, encouraging us in the challenging race of the Christian faith to stay strong and to press on. Our relationship to God is both individual and corporate. We live it out in the community of the redeemed, both those who have gone before us and those living alongside us. Now the preacher of the book of Hebrews comes to the end of his sermon, and his focus is on how do we live in light of this relationship we have with the living God. And he really presents two choices. He describes these choices as two biblical mountains. The first is an Old Testament mountain, Mount Sinai, where Moses received the law. And the second is the heavenly mountain, Mount Zion, the New Jerusalem. I want to read to you a passage from Hebrews chapter 12. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given, that even if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. These two mountains could not be more stark in their contrast. One is an inapproachable mountain, one that cannot be touched, can't be approached, one that makes you tremble with dread and fear. Even Moses, who eventually would go up on that mountain, said, I tremble with fear. God is described in the Bible as a holy, holy, holy God, a consuming fire. In the words of our preacher from Hebrews, and we need to worship him in reverence and awe. But because of the word from our great high priest, Jesus, because of the work that he does as great high priest who offers himself as a sacrifice for us, because he invites us to draw near to the Holy of Holies through the blood of his sacrifice and through the veil of his flesh, we actually can approach a very different mountain from the one that Moses approached. We can approach the heavenly Mount Zion. And that mountain is described completely differently. It's a mountain that is approachable. It's a mountain where there's lots of activity and people, angelic creatures, a joyous assembly, worshiping and celebrating the living God. It's a mountain where God dwells and where Jesus is and where we can enter right into that heavenly worship as Jesus has ushered us through his sprinkled blood. You know, we have a choice to make. And that choice is, which way are we going to relate to God? Are we going to relate to God as if God is unapproachable, somebody who is other, transcendent, a God who is holy, yes, and maybe even a little scary, but one who we don't have a personal relationship with? Or do we want to relate to God as a God who calls us into worship, into an intimate relationship with him, who draws us in order that we might be reconciled to him, in order that we might join a holy and heavenly community of worship, a joyous assembly of the faithful, an experience of love, peace beyond imagining. Which choice will you make?
This is why I'm so grateful for the Trinity, that we have a God who became man. That's the approachable God. Jesus is the approachable God. I also believe God is very loving. He's also a very righteous God. But so that's, I think, the tension. You stand in awe because God is righteous and we are judged. But we have Jesus.
I don't think I have a tension. I know how great He is and how powerful He is. I see His creation, and I am in awe. Like, I see my kids and how wonderful they are. I see friends. I see Him everywhere. But I don't see the tension. I know He is all powerful. He's wonderful, awesome. But my relationship has always been I can go to Him whenever I need it.
I don't think there's ever a time where I'm like, well, I'm not worthy to talk to Him. But there's certainly times where I don't want to. And it's not, I don't even know that it's necessarily a thing of anger, that I'm mad at Him for something happening a particular way. It's just more of a matter of frustration and not being ready to come to Him with whatever it is that's going on. And I don't know if that's...
Well, there is a tendency in human nature to get a hard heart.
Yeah, and that's probably the best way to put it, for sure.
I really don't have that tension as much. I think of it more in the Old Covenant, New Covenant thing. Old Covenant, come into that mountain, don't touch that mountain, you'll be struck dead, keep your cattle away, they will die as well. New Covenant, grace, being able to approach the mountain because of Christ. And the thing that the thing that would keep me away is my own personal sin would keep me away, and needing to confess that sin and then being able to approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something about when we sin, it makes us want to hide from God.
It gives us the Adam and Eve syndrome.
Yeah.
Go find some leaves.
Go find some leaves. You see, what the book of Hebrews and this study absolutely boils down to as a bottom line is that we're called to live a life of acceptable and pleasing worship to God. Listen to the way that the writer of Hebrews puts it. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. As the preacher closes out his thoughts, his words turn to how we should live on a daily basis. We need to live our lives in acceptable worship to a holy, all-consuming God. Throughout this study, we have been recalling the Israelites and how they were called to worship God in a particular way. And now, as we conclude by looking at how we're called as the New Covenant people of God to worship God through a new and living way offered to us by the Lord Jesus Christ. One of the things that we must finally conclude as we think about worship in the context of our study of Hebrews is that worship is not a solitary act. The Israelites were called to live in community. And interestingly, they were asked to set up their camps in a particular way in the Old Testament. They were to create camps that would look like, if you were looking at them from an aerial view, like a big, large cross. At the center of the cross would have been the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where the worship of the living God took place, the footstool of the throne. Thus, the worship life was to be central to the community life. And this is actually how we ought to think about our worship life. Worship should be central to the community life of the people of God. There are two parts to this question of how we should live a life of acceptable worship to God. First, how should we live a life of acceptable worship inside the camp? In other words, inside the community of the people of God. And second, how should we live a life of acceptable worship when we're outside the camp, when we're apart from the community of the people of God, out in the world, living our daily lives? To address the first question, the writer of Hebrews essentially says, when we're inside the camp, we need to be living a life that is fundamentally characterized by two things: holiness of life and by love, a mutual love and support for one another. What does holiness of life look like? Well, the writer of Hebrews is very specific. It begins with living a holy covenanted life with respect to marriage. He urges all of us to keep the marriage bed pure, to respect and honor marriage. One of the fundamental themes of the book of Hebrews is that God wants to be in a covenant with his people. And so marriage, out of all the symbols, is a symbol and sign of the covenantal love that God has for his people. It's critically important that the people of God hold on to the sanctity of human marriage. The other way to live a life of holiness, the preacher says, is to keep our lives free from the love of money. The love of money is one idol that can quickly draw us away from the love of God. It's the chasing of possessions and other monetary goods that can actually lead us away from dedicating our lives to a holy, holy, holy God. It's one of those reasons why earlier in the book we're reminded that Abraham tithed. When we offer our monies to the Lord, it's a reflection of offering ourselves to the Lord. So inside the camp, we're to live holy, holy, holy lives. And we're also to live loving lives. A loving life is characterized by, well, the Greek word is Philadelphia. We know that word as it means brotherly love. It means that we care about one another, that we're compassionate and loving towards our Christian brothers and sisters. We are mutually caring. The other thing the writer of Hebrews says is that we, inside the camp, need to love the stranger who comes into our midst. And that means in our worshiping assemblies, we need to look around and see if there are people who we don't know. Invite them into our lives and show hospitality to the stranger. So inside the camp, we're to be loving and we're to be holy.
So when I think about holiness, or if I think about worship, that has to be a day-to-day thing, because otherwise I'm not giving God my best. When you think about it, I can't come for my 2 hours on Sunday and just spend those 2 hours saying, now I'm going to worship, now I'm going to be holy, and then I take the other 6 days and I do anything that I want to do. Now I'm no longer thinking about, I'm going to love God and love others.
You live a lie if you don't worship all the time. If you say, God, I love you, but then you don't always hold him in awe and respect and want to please him, then you're living a lie, I think. Mm-hmm. So the word worship, I mean, we use that a lot in our culture these days. To worship is just to idolize something or somebody or money. So when we worship God, we're putting him first. We're idolizing him. He is the most important in my life. And so it's got to be authentic, it has to come from my very being, which is every day, every hour. Mm-hmm. I fail, I sin, but I think, we've talked about that's just a part of being human. But I always want to go back and say, but you are my God. Mm-hmm. And it's your will that I want.
Absolutely. What, practically speaking, how do you feel like that day-to-day worship manifests in your life?
I mean, on Sunday we're asking for his forgiveness. We're asking for his armor on us, and it's not just to forget him the rest of the week. It's to do his work. So holiness for me is doing what he asked me to do, loving my neighbors as myself, putting him first in my life, and it manifests in everything that I do. And then that's the prayer. I hope that you're happy with everything that I do, because I want to do it for you. Your will, not mine. What you created me to do.
We love God through serving God, and we love others through serving others. That's, I think, what, to use that as a model helps us in the context of holiness. And I think, too, it's got to be a ruthless pursuit of, an intentional pursuit, done ruthlessly, of God, because the holiness doesn't come apart from God. That's why worship on Sundays is so important, because it rejuvenates us in God. But, about Wednesday, or sometimes about 12:30 on Sunday afternoon, that holiness, the aura of having been in worship and communion with God starts to decrease. And so what I have to be brought back to is that posture of service. Because if I don't think of it like that, then the heart will get hard, or the love will become more difficult. And oftentimes, even before I'm able to realign my posture, I have to go to God so that He can realign my posture towards service.
He talks about in Hebrews about the love of our fellow members and the care that we show one another, the love for the prisoner who can't make it. And that's like it could be the shut-in. It could also be a Christian in prison. Love for the stranger who comes into our midst, who we don't know but still needs God's love. They're there for us to show love to. So how does love manifest itself in our Christian witness in community?
I think love manifests itself by paying close attention to someone. Back to the very beginning of our conversation about being distracted. For me, love is when I just give you my full attention, and your needs come before my needs. And I'm interested in your growth and not my growth.
We've talked about how the writer of Hebrews describes a life of acceptable worship inside the camp, but how are we to live outside the camp and offer our lives as acceptable worship out there in the world? There's a fascinating passage where the preacher of Hebrews says Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through His own blood. Therefore, let us go out to Him outside the camp and bear the reproach that He endured. He's saying that we need to be willing to follow Jesus out there, outside the camp, into the world where He was crucified, and go and bear the reproach of Christ. When we're outside the context of the people of God, and yet we're living for Jesus, we may undergo persecution and suffering and challenge. And in doing that, we actually are partaking and participating in the very sacrifices that Jesus made on our behalf. We are acting as living sacrifices, laying down our lives as He did for the world. That's how we live lives of acceptable worship to God. So, inside the camp, living holy lives. Outside the camp, we go and join Jesus and live as living sacrifices to the world. So, as we conclude our study of Hebrews, I want to ask you, how are you living a life of acceptable worship to God? The first question is your life centered on worship itself? Is worship the most important thing that centers not only your life individually, but also the life of your Christian community? And as a community of the worshiping people of God, how is acceptable worship manifesting itself inside the camp in holiness of life, in love and care for each other, and in the welcome and hospitality towards the stranger? Finally, how are you taking that worship outside the camp and manifesting it in the world, bearing the marks of Christ in acts of sacrificial love? Jesus died not only for our sins, but for the sins of the entire world. And our worship should lead us first into the very throne room of God, and then back out into the world in mission and in service to His love.